In this world, failed evolutionary attempts by animals often share similarities. However, successful animals that have evolved differ from one another. Some are well equipped from the beginning, while others possess high evolutionary potential. There are also some, like the gastropods we discussed in our previous video, that secure a place in the animal kingdom by exploiting exclusive food sources. But what about a group of animals that lacks almost everything? They don't possess significant evolutionary potential, nor do they have any exclusive food sources. Is it still possible for them to achieve success? Today, we're going to talk about a specific group of animals, bivalves, which belong to the mollusk family. While evolution is fundamentally a passive process driven by natural selection, some animals' evolutionary paths seem like impulsive choices. In our previous episode, we discussed the early stages of mollusk evolution, which actually had a promising start after surviving the initial crisis. However, the ancestors of bivalves made a different decision during this time. They chose regression. They lost various features such as tentacles, eyes, and nervous systems. The painstakingly healed shell became two separate halves, covering both sides of their bodies. The originally crawling gastropod foot evolved into a digging appendage called byssal foot, allowing them to adopt a new way of life, filter feeding while buried in the sediment. This feels like studying for decades, almost graduating with a doctoral degree, only to suddenly decide to drop out and become a food delivery driver. Of course, ecological niches, just like professions, do not have hierarchical distinctions. However, the barrier to entry for the filter feeding niche, such as burrowing and feeding in the sediment, is relatively low. It's important to note that over 100 million years ago, during a time even more ancient than the Cambrian explosion, many primitive animals were already engaged in this type of feeding behavior. By the time bivalves entered the scene, the filter feeding niche was already saturated. In order to establish themselves in this clearly saturated niche, bivalves adopted a simple and crude strategy: imitation of other animals. Their principle was straightforward: imitate those who were more formidable. Bivalves took imitation to the extreme. They imitated the most dominant brachiopods, both in their partially buried filter feeding lifestyle and their defense strategy of using two shell halves for protection. They copied it all. To what extent did they imitate? For example, in this image, the creature depicted is actually a brachiopod. Did you even notice? Although bivalves imitated other animals in this manner, there were no patent laws in the ocean. While they wouldn't face legal consequences for imitation, the initial days of bivalves were not easy. Besides the flourishing brachiopods, they had to compete with echinoderms, tusk shells, and sea squirts, among others, that had similar lifestyles. Everyone was striving their hardest to secure a share of the planktonic food resources in the ocean, leaving bivalves with hardly any opportunities. Thus, throughout the entire Cambrian period, bivalves remained extremely marginal and insignificant. Time passed slowly, and even in the Ordovician period, bivalves were still on the fringes. It was the echinoderms and brachiopods that experienced a major explosion during the Ordovician, essentially monopolizing the benthic filter feeding niche. And imitation was a common practice among them all. Even trilobites joined in to claim their share. Bivalves came dangerously close to extinction. And just at this critical juncture, a major extinction event occurred, the late Ordovician mass extinction, which I mentioned earlier. Think about it. Trilobites still had some mobility, but they suffered heavy casualties. As for bivalves, their situation was even worse. However, immense danger also brings enormous opportunities. In this mass extinction event, the bivalves' biggest rival, the brachiopods, also experienced devastating losses. This leveled the playing field for everyone, bringing them back to the same starting line. Finally, they could engage in a fair duel. after more than 10 million years of fierce competition and struggles. It was time for the bivalves to reclaim the benthic filter-feeding niche. Yes, you guessed it right. The dominant players were still the brachiopods, and bivalves remained as minor characters. At this point, bivalves probably understood a truth. If you imitate other animals, you will always be following behind them. Although bivalves may appear similar to brachiopods on the surface, upon closer inspection, there are differences. For example, brachiopods primarily rely on a cirri outside their shells to anchor themselves to the seabed. When threatened, the cirri can quickly retract, pulling themselves into the sand while keeping the shells closed. On the other hand, bivalves rely on their byssal foot. To hide, they need to dig a hole in the sand, which involves creating an opening in their shell. This process may leave them vulnerable to predators. However, despite being clumsy in self-defense, bivalves possess a slight degree of mobility compared to the immobile brachiopods. You may think that this small amount of mobility is insignificant, but in reality, it serves a purpose. For example, in areas with soft, shifting sands in shallow seas, where waves constantly move the sand around, brachiopods struggle to anchor themselves. They either get buried in the sand or get swept away by the waves. On the other hand, bivalves are more adaptable. When buried by sand, the bivalves dig themselves out if buried too deeply. If buried too shallow, they dig deeper. This adaptability allows them to survive in constantly changing sandy environments. By adjusting their depth, bivalves can avoid being completely buried or exposed, maintaining a relatively stable living environment. This self-regulating ability helps them find the most suitable position on beaches and seabeds, increasing their chances of survival. As a result, in certain intertidal zones and shallow coastal areas, bivalves have managed to outcompete brachiopods and occupy their own ecological niche. Although it may not be a prosperous niche, for bivalves that had limited options, it provided a glimmer of hope for a turnaround. While brachiopods still dominate the majority of the filter-feeding niche, they have a fatal flaw in their body structure. They use a structure called the lophophore, which can be understood as a filtering net. They rely on water currents to pass through the lophophore, capturing food particles and extracting oxygen. Do you notice the problem? If the water current is fast, brachiopods can easily feed and obtain oxygen. However, if the current is slow, they may suffocate and starve. In stagnant water, they would face certain death. This is where bivalves found their opportunity. They evolved an active filtering system that allows them to actively intake and expel water currents. As a result, they no longer rely on the speed of water flow to filter planktonic organisms. This adaptation also enables them to efficiently utilize the oxygen in seawater, leading to a significant leap in their body size. Just like trees in a forest, bivalves can outcompete others by reaching higher and accessing more nutrients. Finally, bivalves embarked on a path of independent innovation, having the capability to challenge brachiopods. However, we know that even if you have surpassed the giants in various aspects, they always find ways to continue suppressing you. Throughout the entire Paleozoic era, the seafloor was filled with countless brachiopods. Even though bivalves can grow to large sizes, they still start as small larvae. As long as they are not given the opportunity to grow, they have no way to compete with brachiopod. Fortunately, in the war of evolution, time is an endless resource. Achieving victory often only requires patience. During this time, bivalves were also searching for new breakthrough opportunities. Since they couldn't surpass brachiopods in the seafloor environment, bivalves shifted their focus elsewhere: freshwater. Entering freshwater is not as easy as it seems. Most marine organisms have a planktonic larval stage. And don't forget, freshwater can flow. These tiny larvae can quickly be swept back into the sea. So even for formidable fish species, many groups have to resort to anadromous migration, to survive in freshwater. As for benthic filter-feeding organisms, they lack the mobility, even as adults, and have no ability to inhabit freshwater environments. That's why you see various filter-feeding animals on coral reefs in the ocean, but they have no place to thrive in freshwater rivers and streams. And bivalves had a simple solution to this problem. In the Devonian period, over 400 million years ago, a branch of bivalves set their sights on the fish that inhabited the animal kingdom at that time. These bivalves evolved a stage called the glochidium larva. Essentially, the larvae developed into a hook-like structure that latched onto the gills of fish with a determination similar to that of an Indian passenger on a crowded train. They clung tightly until they matured enough to burrow into the sediment, freeing themselves from the fish. They then quickly dug into the ground to ensure their survival, thus solving the problem of being swept away by water currents. Starting from the Devonian period, bivalves dominated freshwater habitats using this method. Even today, various freshwater bivalves, commonly known as freshwater mussels, are absolute monopolizers of the freshwater filter-feeding niche. Interestingly, it is the fish they rely on that have changed from generation to generation, from the early jawed fish and cartilaginous fish to the primitive bony fish, and finally to the highly adapted cypriniform fish that thrive in freshwater environments. After the late Devonian mass extinction, although brachiopods remained the dominant filter feeders, the balance of power had quietly shifted. While the brachiopods struggled with their tentacles in loose sediment, they easily anchored themselves to sturdy reefs. On the other hand, bivalves, relying on their digging feet, seemed to have difficulty securing themselves to reefs. Thus, for over 200 million years, filter feeding attached to reefs had remained the absolute stronghold of brachiopods. However, the increasingly powerful bivalves decided to march into this fortress. At the latest, starting from the Permian period, a branch of bivalves evolved into the ancestors of today's oysters. These bivalves directly fused one side of their shells with the reef, launching the first assault against brachiopods in the competition for the reef habitat. Although brachiopods experienced another burst of diversity during the Permian period, it marked the last glory of their empire. Soon after, the most devastating Permian-Triassic mass extinction event occurred. Under the all-around attack of bivalves, brachiopods were unable to recover from the trauma of this mass extinction event. They became well-known living fossils. After seizing the ecological niche, bivalves have firmly maintained control over it until today. The evolutionary potential inherent in bivalves, belonging to the phylum Mollusca, has also been unleashed. As I mentioned earlier, bottom-dwelling filter feeders like bivalves tend to be conservative in their evolution. However, the evolutionary history of echinoderms tells us that animal evolution can truly exhibit immense diversity. For example, in the case of scallops, a family within the bivalve class, they have evolved the ability to rapidly open and close their shells, utilizing a powerful adductor muscle that occupies nearly half of their soft tissues. This bizarre swimming posture makes them true swimming prodigies in the animal kingdom. Don't underestimate their peculiar swimming style. Many immobile bivalves are easily preyed upon by starfish or gastropods. However, scallops with this ability have become one of the less commonly preyed upon bivalves. There are other bivalves, such as Tritignyni, that have engaged in a symbiotic relationship with organisms like zooxanthellae algae, forming a self-sustaining economic model. However, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating bivalves that underwent remarkable modifications is the shipworm, which appeared during the Jurassic period. Please don't be confused. It is indeed a bivalve. Its two shell halves have not degenerated, but transformed into two large teeth used for burrowing into wood. The shipworm's primary food source is driftwood that floats to the sea surface. By the way, shipworms can also bore into wooden ships, almost jeopardizing the era of human exploration and navigation. It's a taste of seafood's revenge, isn't it? people often focus on the rise and fall of the top-level dynasties in the food chain. However, the fierce competition of life on Earth occurs in all ecological niches. In those niches that ferocious predators overlook, there is a group of bivalves silently struggling and rising over a span of over 200 million years. Once they established their dominance, they have flourished ever since. In conclusion, these bivalves have demonstrated remarkable adaptations and survival strategies, showcasing the incredible diversity and resilience of life on our planet.